the Northwest home for paranormal. You're listening to U.S. Phenomenon with your host, Mario Magana.
Shadow of the 1962 World's Fair, the Space Needle. I'm your host, Mario Magana. This is U.S. Phenomenon. If you haven't subscribed to our podcast or watched the stream, you can do so by going to our website, onairmario.com, or you can find us on your favorite podcasting platform. Just search U.S. Phenomenon. We'd like to take a moment to welcome our affiliates, KOSW, KGRG, KAPY, and our flagship station, KVI. Tonight, we're going to talk about something that is not always talked about, and I think that sometimes it can be mostly uncomfortable to talk about. But for those that are believers or non-believers, you're going to be on the edge of your seat tonight. According to a new Gallup poll, 58% of Americans believe God exists, down from 68% in 2001. I wonder if that was like during, I wonder when that poll was taken, if that had anything to do with around the 9/11 stuff too. Fewer than 60% say they believe in hell, down from 71% 2 decades ago. Meghan Henning, an author of Hell Hath No Fury, can explain the consequences, while modern preachers often use the fear of evangelizing. Is there such a thing? Are they trying to get people through the front door? Is this what's really going on? It is my pleasure to welcome to the show Meghan Henning. Welcome. You are a professor. I mean, you're the top dog on this. You're gonna definitely school us and let us know what's really going on. Why are people not believing in heaven or hell anymore? What's going on?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mario. I'm really glad to be here. I can't tell you exactly why people are thinking that, but I have some educated guesses. How about that? I think that one of the things that is really startling, that Gallup poll does not compare the United States to other places in the world, but globally, more people believe in hell in the United States than anywhere else. So that's also something that we want to note, that it's gone down in the United States in the last little while, but we are still leading the globe in preaching about hell here in the United States. And that belief in hell is definitely tied to, you kind of teased this a little bit in your question, right? Are people doing this to persuade people to come through the door? And in the United States, in our world today, that is absolutely part of the picture. That the belief in hell is tied explicitly, in particular evangelical church contexts, to increasing numbers. And we see this in a phenomenon that is exclusive to the United States, the modern day hell house. Have you ever heard of a hell house, Mario?
Only the ones where you go through the haunted house, but never a hell house.
Okay. So I'm a professor in Ohio, and I don't know if you know this or not, but Ohio is actually the nation's capital in number of haunted houses as well. We have more haunted houses in Ohio than anyone else. But hell houses are something that we find in the United States, not only in Ohio. Texas is a huge place for hell houses. There's actually some on the East Coast as well. They're usually run by churches or parachurch organizations, and they are put on around Halloween, but they use the fear of hell explicitly to scare people into conversion. So the orientation of hell today in modern churches and in these hell houses is to try to convert people to Christianity specifically. And they do so not only through the scare tactics of hell, like showing specific punishments in hell in these graphic scenes, but there's usually a room at the end where there's also a fair amount of social pressure. And this happens in church settings too, where there'll be what we call an altar call, where people are kind of told that they need to convert to Christianity now. And in there's a couple of documentaries on hell houses, and you see in those. So if you haven't been to one, you can actually have the experience of seeing some of the scenes in these hell houses firsthand through some of these documentaries, where you see people being sort of cloistered in a room, and at the end of the hell house, and sort of told that they need to, they have like 25 seconds to decide whether they want to convert to Christianity or not. And so they come to these things like you would a haunted house with their friends, and they have all of these people watching them make this decision. And so there's a great deal of social pressure involved as well. And so these are scare tactics that are used to persuade people to convert to Christianity largely. And I think that perhaps part of why we have seen a bit of a decrease in this in the last 2 years. I think one possibility is that the experiences of living through a global pandemic have made us aware of, this is a very individualistic form of religion, right? It's all about the individual person making an individual decision about their personal salvation, or at least that's the way it's phrased in these churches. And the experience of living through a global pandemic has made us all realize that we are connected to each other, right? In fundamental ways. We aren't just individuals making individual decisions that only affect our eternal fate. The decisions that we make every day affect us all. And I think that that's something that we experienced dramatically in the last several years. And I think that that makes a highly individualistic religious practice less attractive. And that, I think, might contribute to part of what we're seeing here.
It's interesting you say that, because I would have thought the complete opposite with pandemic and getting right, or how people look at this. I know that in my situation, being someone who wasn't married anymore, divorced, not knowing what was going to happen during the pandemic, relinking with, my ex-wife, and like coming with a truce to like, we got to get to like, okay, this is like something way bigger than us, right? And being able to work together for the greater cause of our kids, or our, our child, to be a better blended family. Now, this is like way above the weeds, but I would have thought of a survey like this, that during the pandemic, that in numbers would have increased. But because a lot of churches were shut down during the pandemic, maybe that also plays into the fact where, you're not going door to door anymore. And, a lot of churches, they shut down, where there were some churches, and I know of one that I attended, that the doors were open. I mean, yes, people were getting COVID on large levels, but they continued to press and press and press and press to get people to go through the door. Did I watch from home? Sure. Yeah, I definitely did. Now, my beliefs versus someone else's belief, like someone who may, like, to me, no judgment on anybody's piece. At least for me, I just know that I just like, well, I've never seen Bigfoot, I've never seen a ghost, and I always say that. I've never seen a ghost. So I have some faith. Now, is there a higher power? I hope so, because God, that would really suck at the end of the day. Like, we leave, and all this energy, like right now, even us having this conversation, this energy just vaporizes, just goes with the cosmic dust.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the question and the survey data shows that there's a different number of people that believe in heaven from the number of people that believe in hell. So I think the big question behind the question is, can you believe in something that you cannot see and have heaven without hell? Right? Can you have faith in God, or a belief system that involves you trusting in something that you cannot see, and also say, maybe not with this hell stuff? And that's a question that really interests me, and one that I've tried to address in my own research a little bit.
And when we talk about, and I know there's a ton of like shows out there right now, and I know I can't even think of the one with John Goodman, where they're like a lot of tongue in cheek, making fun of different religions, the Christianity, the Mormons, and all these different TV shows that have been, out there. I don't want to say televangelizing, but some of it I've actually laughed at and thought was quite entertaining. And I'm from the old school, so I'm like, okay, whatever. I laughed at it, moved on. My question to you is: back in the day, was in early Christianity, was hell different? And like, were they portraying hell as to get people to come through the front door to, I don't know, want to call it like a money maker, or like get bodies in the seat?
This is a really good, that's a great question, Mario. Thank you. So the earliest hell texts that we have in early Christianity are not written for non-Christians. So the way that hell is used in the United States as a tool for conversion is a different, it's the same rhetoric, it's the same violent imagery that's meant to tug at your emotions, but the rhetorical message is different, right? In the United States, we use that rhetoric, or certain Christians use that rhetoric to try to get people to convert. But in antiquity, this was rhetoric that was used from a Christian author to a Christian audience that was intended to get Christians to change their ethical behavior while they were on earth. The question is, so in ancient minds, the question that we have is, does hell exist? And that's a different question. That's a post-Enlightenment question. What an ancient audience would say is, who's in hell? So not just hell exists, but who's in hell? Because they want to know, what are the punishments and what are the sins and what do I need to stop doing? Right? Which is not to say that everyone in antiquity thought that hell existed. The ancient geographer Strabo, for example, talks about myths, and he says, we still should teach our children myths, even though we all know that they're not true, because they have a good ethical message. So for ancient thinkers, something doesn't have to be true for it to be educationally useful. But we think, so what I think is that early Christians are using these stories, and whether or not hell is a real place is not a question that's on their radar. They're using these stories to get people to take seriously how they're treating each other in this world. And one of the ways that I know that is that the large majority of the sins that are punished in early Christian depictions of hell are the sins that are described in the Sermon on the Mount that center around care for the other. So how you treat your neighbor, how you treat the poor, how you treat those in prison, how you treat the people that you don't agree with. Are you able to give of yourself when it is simply for the good of the people in your community? And so that's really different from the way that we describe, and the way that many people in North America describe and use hell as a rhetorical tool to try to scare people into conversion.
We dropped there for a hot second, but it's just, to me, it seems like the sins were simplistic sins. Very, like, to be honest with you, if this is what we're going with right now, we're all going to hell, because, I mean, I don't remember the last time I talked to my neighbor.
Yeah. So that is actually something that I say very frequently as well, is that if there really is a hell, we're all going. Because there is not, these lists also were pretty exhaustive.
I'm going to run amok right now.
That's there were so many different sins listed in these different texts that there were, and you see this in some of the New Testament texts that people are familiar with, right? The idea that it's not just adultery that's a sin, but that if you even look lustfully on another person that's not the person that you're married to, like, that's a no, right? So there, the point of these stories was to persuade people to behave in a way that took into consideration all of the people around you, and that took the ethical model of Jesus very, very seriously. So seriously that a early Christian saw this as a kind of like, this is the highest ethical goal, not as necessarily a description of
It
a real life.
listen right. And so listening to you describe these things, I had like a whole list of things that I was running through my head. But I think my biggest thing is a sin for a sin, right? And we're talking about like lusting over somebody versus murder or stealing. Those all are the same level of sin. Not one is higher than the other.
Okay, so that's a really interesting question. It depends on whose hell you're in, Mario. So, in the New Testament text, for example, Jesus just keeps referring to the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, or Gehenna. And there's not a distinction made between different places in that place of punishment. But when we get to the Apocalypse of Peter, which is a 2nd century Christian text, not in the biblical canon. There are different places for different kinds of sins and different punishments associated with those sins, but there's not the hierarchy in that hell actually follows pretty closely the Roman household codes, or the Roman standards of social and moral behavior, where men have the highest seniority in the household, and children and enslaved persons have the lowest seniority. And so that structure of hell in the Apocalypse of Peter kind of mirrors what was the broader social standard of moral behavior in Roman society. Then by the time we get to the early 5th century Apocalypse of Paul, which is the text that Dante read right before he writes his Inferno, we do have a distinction between some places and other places, and the Apocalypse of Paul actually identifies a couple of places as being the worst ones in hell. And the people who are in those spaces are, at that point now, and we're talking after Constantine, those are people who deny very specific aspects of early Christian doctrine. So the people who say that the Eucharist is not the body and blood of Christ, or deny the incarnation, are in those really bad places in hell. But it's not the levels that you have in Dante. So Apocalypse of Paul starts to really distinguish, and there are places that are worse than others, but Dante takes what he reads in the Apocalypse of Paul and just really stratifies, so that there are actually some sins that are worse than others, and there's like a very clear hierarchy that we can then trace. And some people think that American Horror Story has actually taken Dante and made a very tightly defined structure for modern sin from there as well.
Because when we talk about this, and you know, I mean, I typically don't bring up my personal life, but I was in a situation where I was engaged, and we were, you know, doing the church thing, and we were having this discussion, you know, and this is going to go way into the weeds, and talking about, as for me, being someone who is a believer, understanding like, look, what one individual is doing with their personal time is none of my business. But according to the book that I read, that book says, you know, don't judge anybody, you know? And so I'm like, okay, this is what the book says. I'm going to go with it,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So what someone does, none of my business.
Mm-hmm.
They have to meet whoever their maker may be. If they don't believe in a maker, however this all plays out. But from what it sounds like to me, I'm going to see them all in hell anyways. Because, well, I say this like tongue in cheek, but God, can you imagine if we were to follow the laws of how simplistic those sins were, how better a world we might actually have. And this is something I'll talk about later because I'm going to bring this up. I want to leave this meat and potato for the second half of the show. But simplicity of those sins compared to, and I'm not saying it was a different world. Well, yes, it's much different, but it just seems like it's so complex now. But to me, it's like the levels of sin have changed where, I'm like, well, I haven't talked to my neighbor. I have not done anything for the poor other than donate to the church. But, and, someone asked me for some money. I'm like, just beat it. Because again, now I'm passing judgment on an individual on the circumstances of what I believe might be the case. So, as we get close to the bottom of the hour, when we come back, I want to ask you, I want to get into the levels again. I want to continue that conversation about the levels of sins. Plus, what does hell look like what happens to us? Maybe you can shed some light on that. What happens to the body if there is such a thing as hell? And where can people find your book? Let's talk about that real quick before we get to the bottom.
Absolutely. So my book is published with Yale University Press. You can buy it directly from Yale University Press or wherever books are sold. And it is specifically looking at these very questions that you're asking about how do the ancient kind of ideas about sin and the body and hell correlate or not correlate to our own ideas today, and how do they maybe inform some of the ideas about the body that we have today in ways that we might not realize. So it's specifically about gender and disability and social hierarchy in the ancient world, and how those things and ancient ideas about criminal justice informed early Christian ideas about hell, but also how early Christians amplified those ancient ideas about the body and justice, and how some of the sediment of those ideas has really influenced especially Western society because of the influence of someone like Dante.
And you have one book out now, and you're working on a second one, right? Is that right?
No, that's my second book. Sorry. Hell Hath No Fury is my second book. My first book is called Educating Early Christians Through the Rhetoric of Hell. And that's about the way that the idea of hell borrows on rhetorical models from the ancient world and Greek and Roman rhetorical education.
Perfect. When we come back, let's dissect this a little bit deeper. I know we need probably 3 hours plus for this, but let's get into a snippet of what hell might look like for the tangibles here for us on this physical plane. And I want to talk about a couple things that I'm going to put out there. Was the Bible written to keep humans from running amok? We'll be back. You're listening to US Phenomenon. All right, so I paused there. We'll take a quick break here for a second. All right, I'm ready if you are.
Sorry, what's that?
I'm ready if you're ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. You have great questions. This is super fun. Thanks, Mario.
Oh, my pleasure. All right, here we go. In 3, 2, 1. All right, welcome back to the show. Oh my goodness, I am so pleased. If you let me get into some formalities real quick. If you're not a subscriber to the podcast and you're listening to the show on one of our radio stations, please go subscribe to our radio show, please. We do this out of the kindness of our heart. We don't make a dime out of this, and it's for you, the people. And I don't know why I sounded like Bane there, but I am a Batman fan, and I love the Dark Knight series. So if you wanted to know, now you know. If you didn't, too bad, now you know. Again, go subscribe to our podcast. Go to my website, onairmario.com, because some people, including myself, will fat finger US Phenomenon, but you can find it on all your favorite podcasting platforms. Just search US Phenomenon. Again, that's all you got to do to find us. Tonight, our guest is spending some time with us to talk about the most not so easy thing to talk about all the time. I mean, someday, according to us, if you missed us earlier chatting about this, we're all going to hell off of early Christianity sins, because we'll kind of recap with that real quick. But I guess we'll all be having cups of coffee. I don't even know what they have in hell. But our guest tonight is a professor at the university. Is it at the University of Dayton, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So our guest is Meghan Henning. Thank you for joining us. And your book is out now. You have two of them, but the one we're kind of going through and talking about, I don't want to talk about hell itself, but your book is, where did I lose? I lost it here in my notes. Wow, that's so of me to lose it here. Where did it go?
Mhm.
Hell hath no fury, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So what the hell? I mean, are we all going there? I know. I'm trying to make this fun, but I don't want to go to hell after listening to us have a conversation earlier about what early Christianities were portraying as sins from back in the day, of like the neighbor situation, stealing. Was that correct as well? Like,
Not caring for the least of these in society, anything that was, but what's interesting and what I noticed in the second chapter of my book, as I started to trace how different depictions of hell in different times and places organized and delineated the different sins that were punished, the lists weren't all the same. So there were some things that were repeated, right? Like I said, there was a strong emphasis on care for the other. But how care for the other was defined in any given historical period was tightly tied to the social values of that society, right? So these are early Christian imaginations of what they think that hell might look like. But those imaginations were often reinforcing, for example, gender norms of a given society. So the sins that were punished around gender in the second century reflected Roman ideas about how people should dress and how people should behave with respect to women and men in the second century. And then as those gender norms changed in the fourth century, we see different things being punished, and we see men and women punished for different things. So to get to your question, I think that actually is good news and bad news. Okay. So I
right.
think it's right. I think it's bad news in the sense that when we talk about hell in the contemporary world, we have the maximum, this rhetoric is powerful, and we have the potential to really hurt people. And this rhetoric has been hurting people in many ways for a long time because it's been reused to reinforce social hierarchy. But the good news is that we also have um, a great deal of power in how we think about the afterlife. And we're part of, if we are a part of a Christian tradition, we're part of a long tradition of people reimagining the afterlife. And so I think we have the opportunity to join that tradition in progress and rethink these things in ways that maybe don't harm other people. And that would get us back to the kind of ethical core of what was going on in some of these earlier texts.
What's interesting is, and I'll bring this up, and you were talking about the Hell House. Going the other night to a football game, it was interesting because you have these guys with the megaphones, and they're yelling, "You're going to hell! It's going to be." I mean, it's wild.
Wow! At a football game in
But this is like, yes, outside. Everyone's congregating, kids, families, everyone's like, it's summertime. What a great night to go watch a football game. But you got this
about
guy,
how you're going to hell.
same with the baseball game. You got this guy out here with the megaphone. Everybody's gonna go to hell, and you hear this kid say, "Dad, we're just going to the football game. Why are we gonna go to hell?"
Yeah, legitimate question. Legitimate. That is out of the mouths of babes.
It's unbelievable. I'm like, this fear mongering is not going to put bodies in steeples or in churches. Look, I'm sorry, but it's just not working. You might get one.
Yeah.
So asking this, people, going out to preach the word, the fear monger, just the fear of continuing to portray this hell place.
Mm-hmm.
even as such a young age of being taught about hell and going to Christian daycare back in the day,
Mm,
I'm like going back and having like hell was hot and fire and like
mhm.
lead and just this really scary place. If you know, I don't know. I thought I was going to hell because these kids were like, "Hey, go kiss this girl over there," and next thing you know, I'm going to the pastor's office. I don't know. Why do Americans? Maybe this is maybe a very broad question, but is this really just to get bodies in the seat? Does the fear of making this place the most worst place to be, does it really exist? I guess is the question.
I think that it's been used to get bodies in seats for a long time, right? It begins with Jonathan Edwards and the fire and brimstone preaching that was a part of early American culture. It fits very well with our capitalist society and our focus on individualism and individual idealism around the role of a single person in making a decision. But I think it would be unfair to say that the person who's shouting this at a football game is doing this just to get people into the church, and I think you're right in saying that I don't think that kind of preaching about hell is terribly effective either, if we're honest, right? I don't see a lot of people being like, "Oh, yeah, I'm gonna skip the football game and go um, follow that guy." That doesn't typically happen. I think those folks really do believe that this is true, and I think the other piece of this that we haven't talked about yet is that a lot of this has to do with the literal model of interpretation of biblical texts that we see in these evangelical churches in America as well. That like these people really believe that the only right way to read the Bible, to read ancient Christian texts, is through a very literal reading of every word. And so there's no other way. If the biblical text talks about hell, then that means that there has to be a literal hell underneath us. The problem is that that is not the way that early Christians read the Bible at all. So, because modern US evangelicalism is focused on what Martin Luther would have called sola scriptura, or for them, like the Bible is it, like that's all there is to Christianity,
That's right. Yeah.
right? There's a whole bunch of Christian tradition from the second century to Luther that's missing, where there were all kinds of practices for reading scripture, and many of them were not literal. You even have, so for example, the book of Revelation, did you know that it almost didn't make it into the New Testament?
I did not know that, but it is.
So one of the reasons that it almost didn't make it into the New Testament is because some of the church fathers saw that there were groups of early Christians that were reading that book literally, and they were like, this is dangerous and a very bad idea. I don't like the way these other people are reading this text. Maybe we shouldn't include it because this is not a good idea. And so ultimately Revelation does make it into the canon because many of the fathers said, no, like let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's teach people how to read this text figuratively or as a metaphor for something else. But um, but there were very strong reading traditions that were focused on intellectual engagement with the Bible, and intellectual engagement with the Bible was called spiritual reading, right? If you were reading the text literally, you were not being spiritual enough,
Wow.
according to many of the church fathers. And so this is what is really stunning about this, is that many of these passages that are being used um, in a kind of literal reading mode are warping Christian tradition from the perspective of many of the practitioners of that tradition over the course of the 2,000-year history.
And when we talk about this, this book, um, and Revelation, that's very interesting that you said that Revelation almost didn't make the book. But I mean, I've probably spent more time in that book than most other parts, and I've I, I've spent more time reading. I'm still struggling to get through the entire book. I'm still in the Old Testament. For God's sakes, this
There's a
thing is
lot there.
there's a lot. Here's what I will say, and for those who are like, "Oh my God, I can't believe they're doing this show." Look, I'm doing this because I find this to be
Care.
so fascinating.
Yeah.
But my question to you is, let's just say, for talking purposes, that this book that we're talking about was a manuscript. Well, it is a manuscript, right? But this manuscript was put on this planet to keep the human race from running amok, to keep some type of order, some type of fashion, be kind to others. The Ten Commandments seems to be so simplistic. If that was the case, and there is, I mean, I guess, how do I word this correctly without like blowing the doors off? Everyone's like, "Oh my God, the guy doesn't," whatever. I mean, you're going to believe whatever. But if this was the case, God, what a great way to keep some type of order. But it seems to me that from our conversation, that the book has continued to evolve with different stories, and the way things have been treated. Nowadays, I think modern Christians really still look at the book black and white. And I know that seems to be how it is when I listen or watch or attend church. It's very much black and white. Um, do I sometimes decipher and change my stuff up? Yes, for sure. But if that's the case, and you're talking about this book is supposed to be spiritual, and we're supposed to be taking the book and not literally reading it verbatim, but supposed to be with the book spiritually, then we're reading the book completely wrong then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the reasons that I tell that story and bring it up for folks is that I think that reading the biblical text as a black and white, literal text, uh, cuts us off from what could be a really powerful spiritual resource, and one that could be dynamic and one that we could engage in multiple periods of history in new and different ways, that could actually nourish us for the moment that we're in. So when we read, if we do follow these spiritual reading practices as some of the church fathers described them, and really engage the text intellectually and ask questions instead of looking for propositions, um, the text could have the power to really speak to the situation that we're in. But it does require more of us, right? We can't just come to that text expecting it to speak to our situation and our present moment without us doing any work, without us really thinking about the context in which it was written, who it was written for, or how it might be interpreted in our present world. And we are a culture of quick fixes, right?
Yeah.
Especially now, right? We want that instant self-help fix that, for 60 seconds we listen to something and now our whole life has changed. That's what we want, right? That's what Instagram markets to. That's what TikTok offers us, right? Just 90 seconds and you're going to have this life-changing experience and you don't actually have to do anything. Right.
Yeah.
And that's what we want, and we come to the Bible expecting to not have to bring anything of ourselves. And I don't think that that is what the biblical text. I think that that is one way to read the biblical text, but I think that it leaves us undernourished when we approach it that way.
And when you say that, I think of those who may be listening, maybe they're not believers of anything. What do you say to them?
Well, so a person doesn't have to come to the biblical text expecting to be spiritually nourished. Um, and I think that you can still learn from it, and many of my students come from this perspective as well, right? And look, I'm a historian. You don't actually have to my book, you don't have to believe in anything to find my book interesting, because it still tells us a story about how we got to where we are today in terms of the influence of the history of Christianity on the modern world. So I think for people who are not believers, this topic is interesting because some of these ideas have influenced our criminal justice system. Some of these ideas have influenced the way that we think about gender and disability and the body in our contemporary world. And so there's a long inheritance around these ideas around damnation and hell that connects to things that we might not necessarily think that it does. And whether or not people believe in hell or come to these texts looking for spiritual nourishment, they have still had a pretty profound impact on a number of people, like in your own stories, talking about, your experiences in school and the way that you might have been taught about these things in school. I encounter a lot of people who have really been traumatized. I think people use the language of religious trauma. A lot of people have really serious religious trauma around these ideas. Even if they were not part of a religious context, they still might have been in a space where somebody told them about hell in a way that did violence to them and that they have had to think about and recover from. And so I think that whether it's individual religious trauma or it's the corporate experience of, okay, we all have this idea somehow that individuals have to be punished with a physical bodily punishment that matches in measure and intensity the crime that they committed, right? And we've got that from a system of torture from antiquity,
Right.
right? That we can't seem to put down, right? Those are big questions and things that I'm trying to intervene in with my work.
Oh man. What's so interesting in general, I think that when you talk about people who may be believers, non-believers, who have had, I think the fear. Let's just talk about the fear
Mhm.
of, I mean, I use myself an example, going to a Christian daycare and, if you do this, you're going to go to hell, these kinds of things. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, so everything is all hands off. It's,
Me
I mean,
too.
I'm the generation of, here's a key. Make sure you take the meat out of the freezer, put it in the sink, put some water in there and turn the faucet on so that when we come home that we can have dinner. Right. Now, I'm not going to hell for that, but what's interesting to me is when we talk about this, and I want to talk about a couple other things. One, what the levels of sin, I want to go back to that.
Okay.
So let's say I stole this apple because I was hungry. I think that's a pretty simplistic versus, I broke it. I don't know. Let's just say someone murdered somebody. Wait, let's go back. And I don't want to go that far, but we'll go back to the lust of looking at somebody.
Yes.
So someone was hungry. They took the apple. They ate the apple. Wow, that's so odd. And then somebody was lusting over somebody. Now, those two sins in general, I think from what I have learned, were the same sin in levels. Like apple was stolen, you were lusting over someone, adultery, murder, same level, same crime. Not that,
Do you know why that was the case in some of these ancient texts?
that's a great question. I'm going to just say,
Do you want to know?
yes, I want to know, but I
I'm
just was like,
trying to tell you, Mario.
I was, wait, how the hell No pun intended. How is adultery and murder the same? You know what I mean? Like, how are those the same level?
Okay. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm
All
ready.
right. So, in Roman law, a man is not considered an adulterer if he is married to a Roman woman but has sex with a prostitute. That's not adultery. Okay.
Okay.
Having sex with a married woman, that's adultery. And in the Apocalypse of Peter, the 2nd century, the earliest Christian apocalypse to like really describe hell in detail, the men and women who are punished for adultery, the women have dressed in fancy ways and braided their hair, and the men cry out, "I didn't know I would come to hell." And this is because, right? And you're thinking, oh, there's like a double standard, and these women are being held accountable for this sin because they led the men to lust. It's not necessarily about that. It's because if they were dressed differently, the men who slept with them might have thought that they were not married women because how you dressed signaled to other people whether or not you were married. And so these men accidentally stole somebody else's wife and they didn't know that they were committing adultery. And this is why theft and adultery are treated the same way, because adultery in many of these texts is not about breaking the bond of marriage. That's not how they defined it. You stole someone else's wife, is what you did.
Ah,
Okay.
yeah.
So, and it's still a sin against the other because you have created economic repercussions both for the husband, but now also potentially for the wife as well, who like in a situation, and this is a separate conversation, my students often find very interesting that, right, divorce is also a problem because it would leave an ancient woman destitute and impoverished. And so it's also a crime against, like, you've created a situation of
Yeah, because back in those days, it was not like she was out working,
exactly,
right?
right.
She was,
So this is why sometimes when we read these texts or even hear about like levels of sin, etc., we aren't able to easily make the connection because we have different social norms and these things mean really different things in our own world. And that's where getting the historical information, whether you're coming at this from a place of, wow, I really take these texts seriously and they're in some way normative for me, or if you're coming from a place of, I just want to know where these ideas came from and why we think some of these things still today, or why some of these things, like why, what I gave a talk at another university one time and a student was like, that's a terrible double standard, it sounds like. And I'm like, yes. But
yeah,
they're like, I still see that happening in my own world. And I'm like, also yes.
yeah. So being enlightened now, I'm like, okay, yeah. Basically, I'm not saying that this is happening to me. Look, I'm single, so but I'm free to move about the country. But um, if an individual was living in these biblical times,
Mhm,
and he saw this radiant woman who had been dressed a certain way,
mhm.
the you think they would have like the ring would have been a situation, but that's a material piece, and especially in those times, that wasn't always readily available to have that type of materials, depending on what your levels
Right.
of
I mean, to be fair, the male adulterers in the Apocalypse of Peter are still in hell, whether they knew or not that they were going to go there, right? So, what we see in this text is probably early Christians intervening in some of these moral norms and saying, like, yes, this dress thing is a problem and we should not do that, but also you should. So, this is Christians actually intensifying the standard so that it is it is a standard that is held, men are held to the same standard as women to some extent.
if we're all going to hell. I
Mhm,
had why did this just left my mind? What happens? Like, oh, okay. So in the Bible it says, "Hey, by the way, you go to your maker and you're like, please forgive me of my sins. And if we talk about, Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. And everyone says, okay, you've been forgiven of your sins. I think there was even an article, I don't remember which crazy serial killer, if it was Dahmer, who was, I don't remember if he was like, they said he professed that he asked for forgiveness and he was going to go to heaven. I was like, what? How is this even possible? Okay. If we are forgiven for our sins, are we still going to see people in hell for their crimes?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is one of those things where my research can take me, I can give you the historical context for all these
Right.
texts. I can tell you what's going on in them. And then I can tell you that what I know to be true about the Bible based on what I have read. From what I take from all of the work that I do is that the ethical core of many of these texts is about love and care for the other. And that for many people, um, God, that these texts profess a God who loves humanity from beginning to end, right? That is the central message of these biblical texts. And what scholars and practitioners who are asking questions about hell are frequently asking is the bigger question of um, if this stuff is performing this particular rhetorical role and it's tied to these ancient cultural norms, then why would we hold on to an idea that seems to be directly at odds with the rest of the message of these texts, which is that God really loves humanity and wants to intercede for humanity? So in some of the texts that I study, um, well, in all of them, the saint who is being taken on this tour of hell and told about all of these punishments
Right.
is frequently asking Jesus or God to intercede on behalf of the damned. And what's really interesting is that in several of the texts, God does. So sometimes the damned are given a day of rest on Easter Sunday. Sometimes the damned are given a multiple days of rest, a longer period of rest. And in several of the texts, hell is completely obliterated. And God has mercy on all of the damned. And in fact, Orthodox Christians don't believe in eternal conscious torment. They believe that hell was obliterated um, by Jesus. And when on the descent to hell during the Easter Saturday. So there are practicing Christians who do not think that hell is necessary theologically for their belief system. And what I would challenge people to think about is if we're really taking these texts seriously intellectually and doing what the church fathers would call spiritual interpretation and really thinking seriously about them intellectually, um, is that necessary? Is there, and does it make intellectual sense to hold together the idea of a God who is loving and cares deeply for humanity and intercedes for humanity on multiple occasions? Why would that God put us all in an underground prison that looks like the worst punishments that were imaginable in Roman society, and that were exclusively for those in the lowest end of the social hierarchy? It just doesn't square with the
Yeah,
rest of what we know about God.
for sure. As we get close to wrapping things up, I got to ask you this. This is going to be one. What's your thoughts on the book of Revelation?
Um, Generally, or
Just in general, because it
I feel
there
like that's like a whole separate conversation, Mario. We could have a whole other hour about that.
right.
Um, so, I think that a lot of the things that we've talked about so far with respect to different ways that people interpret texts hold true for the book of Revelation. So there's a long tradition of Christians who think that This is a literal telling of the events that will happen at the end of time, and they try to tie it to a specific event or date or person. And
Right. Yeah.
and those predictions and timelines have never exactly lined up. And then there's also an equally robust tradition within Christianity, probably more robust if we're looking at antiquity, of Christians who say, you need to think about the way in which this text is a particular reading of a historical moment that is meant to inspire Christians in other historical moments similarly. So I think that the book of Revelation is a piece of literature that is tied to a specific moment in Christian history. And I think it was written to respond to that moment in early Christian history. And it has a very strong, anti-imperial impulse. It is really critiquing the Roman Empire. I think all apocalypses have an element of social critique in them. That's what they're for. That's why the weird images are there. It's meant to get you to go, huh, right? The images are weird on purpose to
Right.
shock and startle you and to make you think. And if they don't make you think, if they make you think that you have to go out and tell other people how it is, you're probably not reading the apocalypse right. And I think that's true for the book of Revelation.
For sure. As we get close to wrapping everything up here, I just thank you for your time, enlightening me, sharing this with our listeners and audience. For those who want to find your book, they can do so on Amazon, or even where are some other places they can find your book?
Oh, the Yale University Press website, I think that all of the places that sell Barnes and Noble, all the places that sell books have it.
A link in the podcast if you're looking for it.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. We'll go to the podcast because it's always easier just to go and look and then just click on the thing.
There it is.
It's so like you said, we live in a day and age where everything's just like
Right there.
right
We want it fast.
No, for sure. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank
Thank
you
you for just sharing, and we'd love to have you back on sometime to talk maybe more about some other pieces. But for those who may not be Christians, those who are Christians, again, this is all about the historical pieces that you're sharing in your book that they can find on the website. We'll have it clicked on ours. If you want to find the book, it's super easy to find. It is on Amazon. I did check. The book is called Hell. Why can't I even say this? I'm like tongue twisting this up. It's supposed to be as simple as saying hell hath no fury. And on that note, is hell really on fire? Does it really have a boogeyman? Because I don't know, man. I mean, if you ask me, I'm all jacked up. I probably got to go back to some serious. I got to go back to therapy and work out my.
Oh no, this is supposed to be helpful.
No, this has been super helpful. But looking back at my having faith at a young age, it was just again, as you talked about, distorted. And why, and even being a young kid or just in general, why wouldn't God love everybody, even like forgiving them of their sin? Why did there have to be a hell? Again, that's why, and this is my own personal belief. I'm not pushing on this on anybody, but again, God, I can't even imagine that there is a hell. But if there is, I definitely don't want to be there. And I think that the simplicity of what you were talking about earlier with early Christianity, God, this world would be such a better place if we followed the laws of what the book said back in the day, just being loving neighbors. It'd be a whole nother world.
I do think it could go a long way if we care for the other. And that's ultimately, if we use the rhetoric of fear, if we are focused only on conversion, we risk doing violence and bringing to earth things that weren't meant to be here. Is my strong feeling after doing the research for this project. So I think that, and that are counter to the message of these texts, whether they're normative for you or not. So I, and when I talk about how, everybody's going there, for me, that suggests, because nobody actually sins in just one way. I don't know about you. I'm going to speak for myself.
Yeah.
Nobody has just one of these sins. And that speaks to me to the way in which these were really meant as object lessons, right? And not as a map of
Yeah.
a subterranean space. The fire, the punishments, all of those things come from Roman punishments and ancient disciplinary tactics and punitive structures that used these tortures, and unfortunately Christians intensified them and made them even more frightening in the ways that they imagined afterlife spaces. So I think the message of the book and the answer to your question about, is there fire, uh, is that yes, there's fire in the imaginations of early Christians, and we have a great responsibility, no matter how we're approaching these texts, to think about the implications of that for our contemporary world and how we can make the world into the ethical model that we think should be at its center.
If anything I take away from this, I'm going to go out there and continue to be a better person in regards to living the rest of my life of loving others for who they are and helping out where I might be able to help out. That's what I'm taking away from this.
That's
So
a lot.
again, thank you. You can find her book. We'll have it linked in our podcast if you're looking for it. Meghan, Henning, thank you so much for coming on the radio show from the Pacific Northwest. I want to thank all of our affiliates. Thank you for listening to the show. If you're not a subscriber to our podcast, you can do so by going to our website, onairmario.com, or go to your favorite podcasting platform and just search U.S. Phenomenon. For my entire team, Mark Christopher, Sophia Magana, and myself, Mario Magana, be sure to look up at the sky because you never know what you might see. Good night.